The restaurant hummed with the kind of expensive quiet that money buys: thick carpet, soft lighting, waiters who moved like shadows between tables draped in white linen. I adjusted my tie, the same navy one Margaret had picked out for our 35th anniversary, and watched my son David lean back in his chair with the confidence of a man who'd never doubted his place in the world. "Another bottle of the Bordeaux," he told the waiter without looking up from his phone. "The good stuff. We're celebrating." I wasn't sure what we were celebrating. David had called 3 days ago with his usual blend of charm and urgency, insisting I join him and his friends for dinner at Le Bernardin. Just the guys, Dad, like old times. But sitting here now, surrounded by men half my age in suits that cost more than my monthly pension, I realized this wasn't about old times at all. To my right sat Marcus, David's business partner, a lean man with predatory eyes who'd made his fortune in tech acquisitions. Across from me was Jonathan, married to money and proud of it, whose handshake had been deliberately crushing, and beside David sat his newest addition to what he called his inner circle, a hedge fund manager named Trevor, whose laugh was too loud and too frequent. The wine arrived. David made a show of tasting it, nodding his approval like he was doing the sommelier a favor. "Excellent choice," he said, though I'd watched him point randomly at the wine list. "My father here taught me to appreciate the finer things. Didn't you, Dad?" I nodded, though the last bottle of wine Margaret and I had shared was a $12 Chianti from the grocery store, and we'd thought ourselves rich drinking it on our back porch as the sun set over our modest neighborhood. "Speaking of appreciation," Marcus said, swirling his wine with practiced precision, "David tells us you're finally ready to make some smart moves with your assets." The phrase hung in the air like smoke. My assets. As if my life's work was just numbers on a spreadsheet waiting to be optimized. "I don't know about that," I said carefully. David might be getting ahead of himself. David's laugh had an edge I didn't recognize. "Dad's being modest. He's got the lake house up north, 3 bedrooms, private dock, probably worth $400,000 now, plus the garage downtown that's sitting on prime real estate." He turned to face me, and something in his expression made my chest tighten. "The thing is, Dad, you're not getting any younger. 78 next month, right?" 68, I corrected quietly. "Right, 68. Point is, at your age, what do you need with all that property? The maintenance alone must be killing you." I thought of the lake house, the place where Margaret and I had spent every summer for 22 years, where I'd taught David to fish off the dock, where we'd had our last family vacation before Margaret got sick, the garage where I'd built my small auto repair business from nothing, working 16-hour days until my hands were permanently stained with grease and my back ached every morning. "I manage fine," I said. "Sure you do," David said, but his tone suggested otherwise. "But managing isn't thriving, is it? I mean, when's the last time you actually used the lake house? Last summer? 2 summers ago? Last weekend," I wanted to say. I'd driven up alone, spent 2 days sitting on the dock where Margaret used to read her mystery novels, watching the water change color as clouds passed overhead. But David wasn't really asking. Trevor leaned forward, his cologne sharp and expensive. "David's right, Mr. Dalton. At your stage of life, liquidity is everything. Cash gives you options." "Options," I repeated. "Exactly," Marcus chimed in. "Freedom. No more worrying about property taxes, repairs, insurance. Just clean, simple investments earning you money while you sleep." The waiter appeared with our appetizers, something involving truffle oil and microgreens that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than on a plate. I picked at it while the conversation swirled around me, these men discussing my life like I wasn't sitting right there. "The beauty of it," David was saying, "is that Dad wouldn't have to worry about any of the details. Sarah and I could handle the whole transition: property management, asset liquidation, investment portfolios. We've got connections for everything. Sarah, my daughter-in-law, who'd never liked me and never bothered to hide it, who'd convinced David to move across town after their wedding, farther from the old neighborhood where Margaret and I had raised him, who'd stopped inviting me to family dinners after Margaret died, claiming I brought down the mood. "That's generous of you," I said, "but I'm not ready to sell anything." The table went quiet. David set down his fork and looked at me with the patient expression he'd perfected during his MBA program, the look that said he was dealing with someone who didn't understand how the world really worked. Dad, he said slowly, I don't think you're seeing the big picture here. That garage is sitting in a part of town that's about to explode. Developers are buying up everything within a 3-block radius. You could probably get twice what it's worth if you move fast. It's my business, I said. I built it from nothing. And it was impressive, 30 years ago. But let's be honest, when's the last time you actually worked on a car? When's the last time you made real money there? The words stung because they carried a grain of truth. Since Margaret died, I'd lost much of my appetite for the long days and aching joints that came with automotive repair. I'd started taking fewer jobs, turning away customers who would have once been grateful for my help. The garage had become less a business and more a place to escape to, surrounded by the familiar smells of motor oil and metal. The point is, David continued, his voice gaining strength, you're sitting on a gold mine and living like you're broke. It doesn't make sense. Jonathan nodded sagely. David's right. My father went through the same thing, held onto his business way too long, missed out on millions because he was too sentimental to see opportunity. It's not about sentiment, I started to say, but David cut me off. Isn't it? His voice was sharper now, loud enough that the couple at the neighboring table glanced over. Dad, you're 68 years old, living alone in a house that's too big for you, clinging to properties you barely use. It's not healthy. Marcus cleared his throat. What David's trying to say is that you've earned the right to enjoy your golden years. No stress, no responsibilities, just comfort. Comfort, I repeated, testing the word. It tasted like ash. David leaned forward, and for a moment I saw a flash of the boy he'd once been, earnest, eager to please, looking for approval. Dad, I know this is hard. Letting go always is, but Sarah and I, we want to take care of you. We want to make sure you're secure. Secure, Trevor echoed. That's what it's all about at your age, security and peace of mind. The conversation moved on to specific numbers, potential buyers, investment strategies that would maximize Dad's remaining years. They talked around me, occasionally directing questions my way, but never waiting long for answers. I found myself studying their faces, smooth, confident, unmarked by the kind of worry that comes from building something with your own hands and watching it grow slowly, carefully, over decades. When the main course arrived, some elaborate fish dish that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in a week, David raised his glass. To new beginnings, he said, looking directly at me, and to making smart choices while there's still time. The others raised their glasses. I kept mine on the table. Dad? David's eyebrows rose. The toast? I looked at him across the white tablecloth. This man I'd raised, whose diapers I'd changed, whose scraped knees I'd bandaged, whose college tuition I'd paid by working double shifts at the garage. This man who now spoke about my life like it was a problem to be solved. I need to use the restroom, I said, standing slowly. In the restaurant's marble-appointed bathroom, I splashed cold water on my face and stared at my reflection. Gray hair thinning at the temples, lines carved deep around my eyes, hands that showed every year of honest work. Margaret's voice echoed in my memory. Don't let anyone make you small, Arthur. You're worth more than they know. When I returned to the table, the conversation had shifted to sports, but I could feel the undercurrent of expectation. David was being patient, allowing me time to process what he saw as inevitable. These men had already decided my future. They were just waiting for me to catch up. As we waited for dessert, David's phone buzzed. He glanced at it and smiled. Sarah wants to know how dinner's going. She's excited about the possibilities. What possibilities? I asked. Well, David said, suddenly animated. We've been looking at this great assisted living community in Westchester. Beautiful place, amazing amenities. We thought once you sell the properties, you could afford one of the premium units. Pool, golf course, social activities. You'd love it. The words landed like stones in still water. Assisted living. They weren't just planning to take my properties. They were planning to warehouse me. I don't need assisted living, I said quietly. Not now, Marcus agreed. But planning ahead is smart. These places have waiting lists. The best part, David added, is that it would be one less thing for Sarah and me to worry about. We could visit regularly, know you're safe and happy. Safe and happy. Filed away in a place designed for people who'd stopped living and were just waiting to die. I set my napkin on the table and stood up. Every conversation at nearby tables seemed to pause. David looked up at me with surprise and the beginning of irritation. "Where are you going, Dad?" "Home," I said. "But we haven't had dessert, and we haven't finished talking about—" "We're finished," I said. "At least I am." David's face flushed. "Dad, sit down. You're making a scene." I looked around the table at these men who'd spent the evening carving up my life like the expensive fish on their plates. "You know what, David? You're right about one thing. I am getting older. But that doesn't make me stupid. Nobody said you were stupid. You didn't have to say it. It was in every word you spoke tonight, every assumption you made." I reached for my wallet, but David waved me off. "Dad, please, just sit down and let's talk about this rationally." "Rationally?" I almost laughed. "Son, there's nothing rational about what happened here tonight. You invited me to dinner so you and your friends could explain to me why I should give up everything I've worked for, everything your mother and I built together." The silence stretched. Other diners were openly watching now, but I didn't care. David's voice dropped to a whisper. "Dad, you're embarrassing yourself." "No," I said, feeling something solid and unshakable settle in my chest. "I'm remembering who I am." I walked out of that restaurant with my head high, leaving behind the expensive wine and the men who thought they could rewrite my story. In the parking lot, under the cold stars, I finally understood something Margaret had tried to tell me in her last days. "Arthur, sometimes the people who claim to love you are the ones who'll try hardest to make you disappear." As I drove home through streets I'd known for 40 years, past the garage where I'd built my reputation one satisfied customer at a time, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Margaret's funeral: clarity. My son thought he could humiliate me into submission, use shame and social pressure to make me compliant. He had no idea who he was dealing with, and he had no idea what I was capable of when pushed too far. "Where are you watching this video from? Leave your location." The house felt different when I walked through the front door that night. Not empty. I'd grown used to empty in the 3 years since Margaret passed. This was something else entirely. The silence had weight to it, pressing down like the moment before a storm breaks. I hung my coat on the same hook where Margaret used to hang her cardigan, the blue one with the pearl buttons she'd worn to every school function when David was young. Her scent had long since faded from the fabric, but sometimes, on nights like this, I could almost catch a trace of her perfume in the air. The living room looked exactly as it had that morning. Nothing had changed except me. The leather chair where Margaret used to curl up with her crossword puzzles sat angled toward the window. A book still open on the side table where she'd left it that final Tuesday before the hospital. The throw blanket she'd knitted during David's senior year of high school lay folded across the arm, its blue and gold pattern catching the lamplight. I poured myself 2 fingers of bourbon, the good stuff I saved for occasions that seemed important enough to mark. Tonight felt important, though I couldn't yet say why. The first sip burned warm down my throat, and I settled into my chair, the one that had molded to my shape over 25 years of evening news and quiet conversations with my wife. On the mantel across from me, our wedding photo smiled back through silver frame. Margaret in her grandmother's dress, me in a rented tux that fit like a wishful thinking. We'd been so young, so certain that love and hard work could build something lasting. She'd been 22, I'd been 24, and the world had stretched out before us like an empty canvas waiting for our lives to fill it in. The photo next to it showed David at 8, grinning gap-toothed beside the go-kart I'd built him for Christmas. I'd spent 3 months in the garage after work, welding the frame, painting it fire engine red, installing a lawnmower engine that could push it to 30 miles per hour, fast enough to feel dangerous, slow enough to be safe. David had driven that cart until the wheels fell off, literally. We'd rebuilt it twice before he outgrew it entirely. I took another sip and let my mind wander back to those days when David would spend entire Saturdays in the garage with me, handed me tools whose names he'd memorized before he could spell them properly. Wrench, socket, pliers. His small fingers had been surprisingly steady. His attention span, remarkable for a boy his age. I'd taught him to change oil, replace brake pads, diagnose engine problems by sound alone. "Why do you like working on cars so much, Dad?" he'd asked one summer afternoon, grease smudged across his cheek like war paint. "Because cars are honest," I'd told him. "They break in predictable ways, and if you fix them properly, they stay fixed. There's no mystery, no hidden agenda, just cause and effect. He'd nodded solemnly, as if filing away wisdom for future use. Like people? No, I'd said, maybe too quickly. People are different. People can surprise you. The memory felt like a blade between my ribs now. David had certainly surprised me tonight, though not in any way I'd wanted. The phone rang, jarring me from my thoughts. David's name appeared on the caller ID, and for a moment I considered letting it go to voicemail. But habits die hard, and 40 years of answering my son's calls wasn't easily broken. Dad? His voice sounded smaller over the phone, less certain than it had in the restaurant. Are you okay? You left pretty abruptly. I'm fine, I said, though we both knew it wasn't true. Look, maybe we came on a little strong tonight. The guys can be intense about business stuff, but the core message is sound, Dad. You've got assets that aren't working for you. I set my bourbon down and walked to the window, looking out at the street where I'd lived for 38 years. Mrs. Patterson's porch light was on 2 houses down. She always left it burning for her grandson, who worked night shifts at the hospital. The Kowalskis had finally fixed their fence after the storm last spring. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that someone a few doors down was having his entire existence dissected like a biology experiment. David, I said finally, do you remember the summer you turned 16? What? The question seemed to catch him off guard. I guess. Why? You wanted that Mustang convertible, red one. We looked at it 3 times. Dad, I don't see what... It was $12,000, way more than I could afford. But you wanted it so badly, and your mother thought you deserved something special for getting into state. A pause. I remember. I took out a second mortgage on this house to buy that car. Worked double shifts for 8 months to make the payments. Your mother took a part-time job at the library, her first work outside the home since you were born. Dad, do you know why I did that? Another pause, longer this time. Because you loved me. Because I loved you, I agreed. Because parents sacrifice for their children. Because that's what family means. But also because I thought if I gave you what you wanted, you'd understand what I was giving up to provide it. I did understand. I do understand. Do you? I asked. Because tonight, sitting at that table, listening to you and your friends discuss my life like it was a business problem to be solved, I realized something. You learned the wrong lesson from that car. What do you mean? You learned that if you wanted something badly enough, if you made a good enough case for it, the old man would give it to you. But you never learned to ask what it cost me. The silence stretched between us like a canyon. When David finally spoke, his voice carried a defensive edge. Dad, that's not fair. I never asked you to sacrifice. You chose to do those things. You're right, I said. I did choose, just like you're choosing now. Choosing what? To see me as a problem instead of your father. To see my life's work as assets to be liquidated instead of dreams made real. To measure my worth by my utility to your plans. That's not what I'm doing. Isn't it? I walked back to my chair, picked up the bourbon, held the glass up to the lamplight. Tell me something, David. When's the last time you asked me how I was doing? Not how the properties were doing, not whether I needed help with anything, but how I was managing since your mother died. The question hung in the air like an accusation. I could hear David breathing on the other end of the line, could almost see him trying to formulate an answer that wouldn't damn him. We talk all the time, he said finally. We talk about business, about investments, about what I should do with my assets. But when's the last time you asked me if I miss her? If I still wake up reaching for her side of the bed? If I sometimes drive by the hospital where she died just to feel close to her? Dad, 3 years, David. She's been gone 3 years, and not once have you asked me how I'm surviving it. The admission cracked something open in my chest. I hadn't intended to say it, hadn't planned to strip myself bare over a phone line. But there it was, the truth I'd been carrying alone since the funeral. I didn't know you wanted to talk about it, David said quietly. I didn't want to burden you. You were starting your new business. Sarah was pregnant with what would have been my first grandchild before the miscarriage we never spoke about. I thought I should handle my grief like I handled everything else, quietly, without bothering anyone. Dad, but tonight, listening to you describe my life like it was an inconvenience, I realized something. You don't see me as a person anymore. You see me as a collection of problems that need solving, An aging man with too much property and not enough sense to do what's best for him. David's voice, when it came, sounded strained. I see someone I love who's isolating himself. Someone who's letting valuable assets sit idle while he lives like a hermit. I see my father wasting away in a house full of ghosts. The words hit like a physical blow. Ghosts? Mom's clothes are still in the closet, Dad. Her toothbrush is still in the bathroom. You've turned that house into a shrine, and it's not healthy. I set the bourbon down hard enough to slosh liquid over the rim. Those aren't ghosts, David. They're memories. They're what's left of the woman who loved us both more than life itself. I know that, but Dad, she's gone. And you can't live the rest of your life waiting for her to come back. I'm not waiting for her to come back. I'm remembering what it felt like to be loved unconditionally, something I apparently took for granted. The silence that followed was different, colder, more final. When David spoke again, his voice had shifted back to the businesslike tone he had used at dinner. Dad, I think you're being emotional about this. Maybe we should talk again in a few days, when you've had time to process everything. Process everything, I repeated. You mean when I've had time to accept your plans for my future? I mean when you've had time to think rationally about what's best for everyone involved. Everyone involved. As if my life was a group project where everyone got a vote except me. Good night, David, I said. Dad, wait. I hung up and turned off the phone. The house settled back into its weighted silence, but now I understood what I was feeling. Not grief exactly, though grief was part of it. Not anger, though anger simmered underneath everything else. It was recognition. The same feeling I'd had 30 years ago when I'd first seen the garage space that would become my business. The understanding that something important was about to begin, that I was standing at the threshold of a change that would define everything that came after. I finished my bourbon and climbed the stairs to the bedroom I'd shared with Margaret for 35 years. Her pillow still held the faint impression of her head, though I'd fluffed it every morning since she died. The book she'd been reading still lay open on her nightstand, a bookmark marking her place in a story she'd never finish. David was right about one thing. I had turned the house into a shrine, but he was wrong about why. It wasn't because I was waiting for her to come back. It was because I was afraid that if I let go of these traces of her presence, I'd lose the last connection to the man I'd been when she loved me, the man who'd built something worth having, the man who'd earned respect through decades of honest work, the man who'd never had to justify his worth to his own son. Lying in the dark, I made a decision that felt as solid as the foundation I'd poured for the garage all those years ago. David wanted to treat me like a problem to be solved? Fine. But he was about to learn something his expensive friends couldn't teach him in their business schools. Problems could fight back. And sometimes, the old man had more fight left in him than anyone expected. I woke the next morning with the clarity that comes after a sleepless night spent making peace with hard truths. The bedroom was gray with pre-dawn light, and for the first time in months, I didn't reach for Margaret's side of the bed out of habit. Instead, I lay still and listened to the house breathe around me, the familiar creaks and sighs that had become the soundtrack to my solitude. Coffee first. Always coffee first. I ground the beans by hand, the same way Margaret had taught me when we were newlyweds and couldn't afford an electric grinder. The ritual steadied me, gave my hands something useful to do, while my mind sorted through the debris of last night's conversation. David thought I was being emotional, irrational, unable to see the bigger picture because I was too attached to the past. He'd use that tone, patient but condescending, that successful children use when they think their parents have lost the ability to navigate the modern world. But 40 years of running a business had taught me something David's MBA hadn't: the difference between emotion and instinct. Last night at dinner, my instincts had been screaming warnings that my heart hadn't wanted to hear. I took my coffee to the kitchen table and opened a spiral notebook, the kind I'd used for decades to track garage inventory and customer repairs. At the top of the first clean page, I wrote, Observations, Day 1. If David wanted to treat this like a business problem, I'd approach it like one. Data first, analysis second, action third. Under the heading, I began to list facts. David initiated dinner, chose location, and guest list. Conversation planned in advance, too coordinated to be spontaneous. Marcus, Jonathan, and Trevor clearly briefed beforehand. discussion of assets and liquidity using specific financial terms, mention of assisted living community, research already done. Sarah's involvement confirmed, excited about possibilities. I stared at the list, pencil tapping against the table. Margaret used to do the same thing when she was thinking, that soft drumming rhythm that meant her mind was working through a problem. Think like a detective, she'd say when I was frustrated with a particularly stubborn engine repair. What are the symptoms telling you about the disease? The symptoms were telling me that last night's dinner wasn't an impulsive suggestion from a concerned son. It was a presentation, carefully staged to apply maximum social pressure. David had brought witnesses, successful men, whose approval I was supposed to crave, whose judgment I was supposed to fear. But there was something else, something that nagged at the edges of my consciousness like a half-remembered melody. I flipped to a fresh page and wrote, Timeline, David's recent behavior. 6 months ago. First mention of property values in our area rising 4 months ago. Sarah's comment about the house being too big for one person. 3 months ago, David's sudden interest in my retirement planning. 2 months ago, his offer to help with financial planning. Last month, his suggestion that I consider my options. The pattern was clear once I mapped it out. This hadn't been a sudden concern for my well-being. This had been a campaign, slow and steady, designed to plant seeds of doubt about my ability to manage my own affairs. The phone rang, David's name on the caller ID. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message. Dad, I hope you slept on it and you're feeling more reasonable this morning. Sarah and I would like to take you to brunch, just the three of us. We can talk through everything calmly. Call me back. Reasonable? There was that word again, the one they used when they wanted to suggest that anyone who disagreed with them was being irrational. I didn't call back. Instead, I drove to the garage. The building squatted on a corner lot in what had been the industrial district when I'd first leased it in 1987. Back then, it was surrounded by warehouses and small manufacturing plants. Now, boutique coffee shops and art galleries had moved into the converted spaces, and young professionals in expensive cars drove past my weathered garage doors on their way to yoga studios and organic markets. I unlocked the side door and stepped into the familiar smell of motor oil and metal. The space was exactly as I'd left it the previous Friday. Tools hung in their designated spots, workbenches cleared and organized, the lift positioned over the drain pit where I'd changed more oil than I could count. But seeing it now, through eyes sharpened by last night's revelation, I noticed things I'd been blind to before. How the building's bones were solid, the foundation unwavering despite 40 years of heavy machinery. How the location had become increasingly valuable as the neighborhood gentrified around it. How much space there was, enough for 3 or 4 upscale businesses if someone gutted the interior and started fresh. No wonder David was so interested in my assets. I spent an hour walking through the space, making notes about everything from the electrical system to the heating unit to the structural modifications I'd made over the years. If David wanted to talk business, I needed to understand exactly what we were talking about. My phone buzzed with a text. Dad, we're worried about you. Please call us back. Worried, right. Instead of calling, I drove to the lake house. The 40-minute drive north took me through countryside that had remained largely unchanged since Margaret and I had first discovered the property in 1995. Rolling hills dotted with dairy farms, red barns weathered silver by decades of rain and sun. The kind of landscape that appeared on calendars celebrating rural America. The house sat on 5 acres at the end of a gravel road, a modest 2-story cabin with a wraparound porch that faced the water. Margaret had fallen in love with it immediately, standing in the overgrown yard with her hands pressed to her cheeks like a child seeing Christmas morning. Arthur, she'd whispered, this is where we'll grow old together. She'd been right, though she hadn't lived long enough to see how old I'd grow here alone. I pulled into the driveway and sat for a moment, studying the place with the same analytical eye I'd brought to the garage. The house was solid, well-maintained, because I'd never been able to afford letting small problems become big ones. The dock was sturdy, rebuilt 3 times over the years as winter ice took its toll. The property had mature trees, privacy, and frontage on a lake that had become increasingly popular with weekenders from the city. Another asset. Another piece of the puzzle David was trying to solve. I let myself into the house and walked through rooms that held 27 years of summer memories. The kitchen where Margaret had made pancakes every Saturday morning. The living room where we'd played cards during rainy afternoons. The bedroom where we'd made love with the windows open, listening to loons call across the water. In the master bedroom, I opened the closet and found Margaret's summer clothes still hanging exactly where she'd left them. Sundresses and light sweaters, a straw hat she'd worn for gardening, sandals lined up beneath everything like soldiers waiting for orders. David was right about one thing. I had turned both houses into shrines. But walking through these rooms now, I realized I'd done it for a different reason than he thought. Not because I was trapped in the past, but because I was afraid of the future, afraid of what I'd become, without the identity that loving Margaret had given me. But fear wasn't the same as helplessness. And tonight's dinner had taught me something important. David was afraid too. Afraid that his plans for my assets might be derailed by an old man who still had fight left in him. I spent another hour going through the house, taking photos with my phone, making notes about everything from the new roof I'd installed 2 years ago to the hardwood floors Margaret had insisted on refinishing before her diagnosis. If this was going to be a battle, I needed to know the territory. On the drive home, my phone rang again. This time, it was Sarah. Arthur, her voice had the brittle sweetness she used when she wanted something. David told me about last night. I think there might have been some miscommunication. No miscommunication, I said. I heard everything clearly. Well, maybe we could all sit down together and start over. I know David can be intense when he's trying to help someone he loves. Someone he loves? The words sounded hollow coming from her, like dialogue from a play she'd rehearsed, but didn't believe. Sarah, I said, can I ask you something? Of course. When's the last time you and David visited the lake house? A pause. I'm not sure. It's been a while. 3 years. You haven't been there since Margaret's funeral reception. We've been so busy with work but you know all about the property values. You know about the assisted living community in Westchester. You've done your research. Another pause, longer this time. Arthur, I think you're reading too much into... I'm reading exactly enough, I said. Tell David I'll call him when I'm ready to talk. I hung up and drove the rest of the way home in silence, my mind working through possibilities like a mechanic diagnosing engine trouble. Listen to the symptoms, identify the problem, determine the right tool for the repair. The symptoms were clear. A coordinated effort to convince me I was incapable of managing my own affairs, pressure disguised as concern, financial plans developed without my input or consent. The problem was equally clear. My son and his wife saw me as an obstacle to their financial security, a stubborn old man standing between them and a more comfortable future. The solution would require more thought. But as I pulled into my driveway and saw the house I'd called home for nearly 4 decades, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Margaret's death: purpose. That evening, I made a phone call to Harold Brennan, who'd handled my business legal work for 20 years. A careful man with steel gray hair and the kind of methodical mind that had kept me out of trouble more times than I could count. Arthur, he said when I explained why I was calling, you're talking about some serious steps here. Are you sure this is the direction you want to go? I'm sure about one thing, I said. I won't be bullied out of my own life by people who think they know what's best for me. Family situations can be complicated. Maybe there's a middle ground. Harold, I interrupted. Tomorrow morning, I want you to draft a document that makes my wishes crystal clear, legal, binding, and impossible to misinterpret. A pause. What kind of document? The kind that reminds everyone who actually owns what around here. After we hung up, I sat in Margaret's chair and opened the notebook again. On a fresh page, I wrote, Day 2, begin documentation. David thought he could pressure me into submission using social embarrassment and carefully orchestrated concern. He'd underestimated one crucial factor. I'd spent 40 years building something from nothing, dealing with difficult customers, managing complex problems, and standing my ground when it mattered. I'd learned patience from years of waiting for engines to reveal their secrets. I'd learned strategy from negotiating with suppliers and contractors. And I'd learned that the most effective response to aggression wasn't always immediate retaliation. Sometimes it was preparation. Margaret's photo smiled at me from the mantel, and I could almost hear her voice. Arthur, honey, When someone shows you who they really are, believe them the first time. David had shown me exactly who he'd become. Now it was time to show him who I still was. The next 3 days passed quietly, deliberately. I went through my normal routines: coffee at sunrise, the newspaper spread across the kitchen table, afternoon walks around the neighborhood. But underneath the surface, something fundamental had shifted. I was no longer just living. I was planning. Harold called on Thursday morning to confirm our appointment for Friday. "I've drafted the documents you requested," he said. "But Arthur, I want you to think carefully about this. Once these papers are signed, there's no going back without significant legal complications." "Good," I said. "That's exactly what I want." That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery where Margaret rested beneath a simple granite headstone we'd chosen together during her final week. The inscription read, "Margaret Ellen Dalton, beloved wife and mother. She made everything beautiful." Below that, space for my own name when the time came. I sat on the wooden bench I'd installed beside her grave, the one that faced west so visitors could watch the sunset through the old oak trees. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of dying leaves and the promise of winter. "I need to tell you about David," I said aloud, my voice barely carrying beyond the headstone. "I need to tell you what our boy has become." A red cardinal landed on Margaret's headstone, cocked its head at me as if listening, then flew away in a flash of scarlet wings. Margaret had always believed cardinals were messengers from heaven, though I'd never shared her faith in such things. Today, I wanted to believe. "Do you remember the Christmas when he was 12? I asked the empty air. "He wanted that expensive bike, the mountain bike, with all the gears. We couldn't afford it. Business was slow that winter, and we were behind on the mortgage payments. But you made me drive to 3 different stores until we found one on clearance." I could still see her face that Christmas morning, the way she'd glowed with pure joy watching David's expression as he unwrapped the bike. She'd worked double shifts at the diner for 6 weeks to pay for it, coming home exhausted but happy, because she'd given our son something he'd treasure. "He rode that bike until the wheels fell off," I continued. "Do you remember? He took it everywhere, to school, to friends' houses, on those camping trips we took up north. He loved that bike because he knew what it cost us to give it to him." The wind shifted, rustling the leaves overhead. I pulled my jacket tighter and let my mind drift back to those years when David had been the center of our universe, when every decision we made revolved around what was best for him. The garage had been struggling then. I was competing with the big chain auto shops that could undercut my prices, and I hadn't yet built the reputation for quality that would sustain me through leaner times. There were nights when Margaret and I sat at the kitchen table, calculator in hand, trying to figure out how to stretch $15 until payday. But we'd never let David know how tight things were. He got new school clothes every fall, birthday parties with store-bought cake, Little League fees paid on time, even when it meant eating macaroni and cheese for a week. Margaret had been fierce about that. Our struggles were not his burden to carry. "Maybe that was our mistake," I said to the headstone. "Maybe we should have let him see what sacrifice looked like. Maybe if he'd understood the cost of things, he wouldn't be so quick to spend other people's money now." I thought about the conversation David and I had never had, the one where I explained that the garage stayed open late not because I loved working, but because I loved him. That the reason I came home with grease under my fingernails and aching joints was because every hour of labor translated into security for our family. That the American dream I was building, bolt by bolt and paycheck by paycheck, was really a foundation for his future. But I'd been raised by a father who believed actions spoke louder than words, who'd shown love through provision rather than conversation. I'd followed that model, assuming David would understand my devotion through osmosis, that he'd absorb the values that motivated my sacrifices without needing them explained. "He was such a good boy," I whispered. "Remember his high school graduation? How proud he looked in that cap and gown. He thanked us in his speech, said none of it would have been possible without parents who believed in him." That speech had reduced Margaret to tears of joy. She'd gripped my hand so tightly I'd lost feeling in my fingers, and afterwards she'd said, "Arthur, we did good. We raised a son who knows where he came from." But had we? Or had we raised a son who knew how to say the right things when the spotlight was on him? The signs had been there, even then, if I'd been honest enough to see them. The way David had grown embarrassed by our modest house when his friends from college visited. The way he'd suggested we update our look when he started dating Sarah, as if we were outdated appliances that reflected poorly on him. The subtle shift from gratitude to expectation, as if our support was owed rather than given. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the photos I'd taken over the years. Most were of Margaret, gardening, cooking, reading on the porch of the lake house. But scattered among them were pictures of David at various ages, high school basketball games, college graduation, his wedding day. I stopped at a photo from his wedding reception, taken just before the father-son dance. David looked handsome in his tuxedo, successful and confident. But studying his expression now, I noticed something I'd missed at the time. The way his smile never quite reached his eyes, the slight stiffness in his posture that suggested he was performing rather than celebrating. He was already changing then, wasn't he? I asked Margaret's grave. Already becoming someone we wouldn't recognize. The transformation had been gradual, so subtle that I dismissed each small shift as maturation, as the natural evolution of a young man finding his place in the world. When he'd stopped calling every week, I'd told myself he was busy building his career. When he'd moved across town to a more expensive neighborhood, I'd been proud that he could afford something better than the modest split level where he'd grown up. When he'd started talking about maximizing potential and optimizing resources, instead of simply working hard and treating people fairly, I'd assumed it was just business school jargon that would fade with time. I'd been wrong about everything. That Sarah's influence, I said aloud, though I knew that was only part of the truth. She taught him to see us as liabilities instead of family, taught him that our way of life was something to be embarrassed about, something to overcome rather than honor. But David had been a willing student. Sarah might have provided the vocabulary, but the sentiment had found fertile ground in soil I'd helped prepare. By sheltering him from our struggles, by making his life too easy, we'd failed to teach him the most important lesson, that everything worth having requires sacrifice, and that the people who make those sacrifices for you deserve respect, not management. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded me of the sunsets Margaret and I used to watch from the lake house dock. She'd sit beside me with her head on my shoulder, both of us content to let the silence speak for us. "I miss talking to you," I said to the headstone. "I miss having someone who understood that love isn't a business transaction, that family isn't about maximizing return on investment." A squirrel chattered in the oak tree above, and I found myself smiling at the sound. Margaret had fed the squirrels despite my protests that they'd just dig up her flower bulbs. "Everything deserves kindness," she'd say, scattering peanuts across the backyard. "Even the troublemakers." She'd extended that philosophy to David, even during his most difficult years. When he'd wrecked the Mustang I'd worked double shifts to buy him, she'd been the one to argue against my impulse to let him face the consequences alone. When he'd dropped out of college for a semester to find himself, she'd been the one to convince me to keep his room ready for when he came home. "You always believed he'd come back to us," I said. "Even when he started talking like those business magazines instead of like our son, you said it was just a phase. You said love always wins in the end." But love hadn't won. Fear had won. David's fear that he wasn't successful enough, wasn't wealthy enough, wasn't important enough to matter in the world he'd chosen. And rather than facing that fear by building something meaningful with his own hands, he'd decided to solve it by redistributing what his parents had built. I stood slowly, my joints protesting after an hour on the wooden bench. The cemetery was empty now, except for me and the gathering dusk. I placed my hand on Margaret's headstone, feeling the smooth granite warm from the day's sun. "I'm going to fix this," I told her. "Not for David, he's made his choice, but for us. For what we built together, for the legacy you deserves to have protected." Walking back to my truck, I felt something I hadn't experienced since Margaret's funeral. Certainty. Not about what would happen next, but about what I was willing to fight for. David thought he could rewrite our story, reduce our 40 years of marriage and struggle and joy to a simple math problem with a predetermined solution. He was about to learn that some stories can't be edited by people who weren't there when they were written. That night, I sat at the kitchen table with Margaret's recipe box, the wooden one her mother had given her as a wedding gift. Inside were index cards covered in her careful handwriting, pot roast and apple pie, Christmas cookies and birthday cakes, all the meals that had turned our house into a home. But tucked behind the recipes, I found something else. The letter Margaret had written to David during her final week in the hospital. The letter she had asked me to give him when I thought he was ready to understand what she was trying to tell him. I'd never given it to him. 3 years had passed, and I'd never found the right moment, the right words to explain what his mother wanted him to know. Tonight, I opened the envelope and read her familiar handwriting one more time. My dearest David, if you're reading this, it means I'm gone, and your father has decided you're ready to hear what I couldn't say while I was alive. I was always too proud of you to burden you with hard truths, but pride isn't love, and love requires honesty. You are the best thing your father and I ever created together, but you are not the most important thing we created. The most important thing was the life we built, the values we lived by, the respect we earned, the legacy of honest work and faithful love that we hope to pass on to you. I'm afraid you've confused inheriting our things with inheriting our worth. Things can be taken or given away, but worth must be earned fresh by each generation. Your father earned his through 40 years of keeping his word, treating people fairly, and building something that lasted. The question isn't what he owes you. The question is what you owe the man who taught you that work has dignity and love requires sacrifice. Don't let anyone convince you that taking care of him means taking over his life. Don't let anyone teach you to see his independence as a problem to be solved instead of a strength to be honored. And don't let anyone make you forget that the greatest inheritance parents can give their children isn't money. It's the example of how to live with integrity. I love you, son. But more than that, I believe in you. I believe you can still become the man we raised you to be. The man who understands that family isn't about what you can get, but about what you're willing to give. Your mother always and forever, Margaret. I folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into its envelope. Tomorrow I would meet with Harold and set in motion the legal protections that would secure my future. But tonight, I would decide whether David had earned the right to read his mother's words. Some inheritances had to be earned, and some lessons could only be learned the hard way. Margaret had always been wiser than me. She'd known this day would come, had seen the fractures in our family before I was willing to acknowledge them. Now, it was up to me to honor her faith, not in who David was, but in who he might still become, if the right pressure was applied in the right way. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows that Margaret had loved, because they let in so much light. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to prove that an old man could still surprise the people who thought they had him figured out. But tonight, I sat with my wife's words and remembered what it felt like to be loved by someone who saw strength, where others saw stubbornness, wisdom, where others saw outdated thinking. That kind of love was worth fighting for. And I was just getting started. Harold Brennan's law office occupied the second floor of a brick building that had stood on Main Street since before I was born, the kind of solid, unpretentious space that inspired confidence through longevity rather than flash. I climbed the narrow stairs the Friday morning, carrying a manila folder thick with documents, property deeds, bank statements, insurance policies, and photographs of both the garage and the lake house. Harold met me at the door, his steel gray hair combed back in the same style he'd worn for the 20 years I'd known him. His handshake was firm, his eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses that had probably been expensive when he bought them in 1985. "Arthur," he said, gesturing toward the leather chairs arranged around a coffee table that had seen decades of difficult conversations. "I've drafted everything you requested, but I want to make sure you understand the implications." I settled into the chair and opened my folder. "I understand that my son thinks I'm too old and too stupid to manage my own affairs. I understand that he's planning to solve that problem for me, whether I want him to or not. And I understand that if I don't take action now, I'll wake up one morning to find myself in an assisted living facility while someone else profits from everything Margaret and I built together." Harold nodded slowly. "The documents I prepared will certainly prevent that scenario. But Arthur, once we execute these papers, there's no going back without significant legal and financial complications. Are you absolutely certain this is the path you want to take? Show me what you got." Harold spread 3 sets of documents across the coffee table, like a poker player revealing his hand. "First, a revocable living trust. This transfers ownership of all your properties to the Arthur and Margaret Dalton Family Trust. with you as the sole trustee during your lifetime. You maintain complete control, but the assets are protected from outside claims or challenges to your competency. I picked up the first document, scanning the legal language that would shield my life's work from David's ambitions. What about after I'm gone? That's where document number 2 comes in. Harold tapped the middle set of papers. Your will, completely revised. The trust continues after your death, with very specific instructions about distribution. David receives a modest inheritance, enough to show you didn't forget him, but not enough to fund the lifestyle he's apparently become accustomed to. And the rest? Veterans organizations, primarily. Margaret mentioned several times how much she admired the work they do. The lake house becomes a retreat for veterans and their families. The garage property gets donated to a vocational training program that teaches auto repair to veterans transitioning to civilian careers. I felt something warm settle in my chest. Margaret would have loved that. Taking the places where we'd built our life together and using them to help people who'd served something larger than themselves. Document number 3 is the most interesting, Harold continued. A letter of intent to be executed immediately that clarifies your current mental state and decision-making capacity. If anyone challenges your competency in the future, this establishes a clear record that you were thinking rationally when you made these decisions. I read through the letter, which documented my understanding of my financial situation, my awareness of my family relationships, and my specific reasons for the arrangements I was making. It was clinical, thorough, and absolutely damning to anyone who might claim I'd been manipulated or coerced. There's one more thing, Harold said, pulling out a final document. A durable power of attorney for financial decisions, naming me as your agent if you become incapacitated. This prevents anyone else from stepping in and reversing your arrangements. I studied the papers for a long moment, thinking about the conversation David and I would inevitably have when he discovered what I'd done. He'd be furious, of course. He'd probably threaten legal action, claim I was being vindictive or irrational. But he'd be wrong on both counts. This wasn't about revenge, it was about respect. And it wasn't irrational. It was the most clear-headed thinking I'd done in years. Where do I sign? We spent the next hour going through each document line by line, Harold explaining every clause and consequence while I initiated and signed with the mechanical precision of a man who'd made peace with his decisions. When we finished, Harold placed everything in a fireproof safe and handed me copies in a leather portfolio. Arthur, he said as we shook hands at the door, for what it's worth, I think you're doing the right thing. A man's life's work should be protected, especially from people who see it as a solution to their own problems. Margaret always said you were the smartest lawyer in town. Margaret was a wise woman. I'm sorry she's not here to see you stand up for yourself. I left Harold's office feeling lighter than I had in months, but I knew the legal protections were only part of what I needed. David was smart and persistent. He wouldn't give up just because some papers made his plans more difficult. If I was going to truly secure my independence, I needed to make the cost of challenging me higher than he was willing to pay. That afternoon, I drove to the home of Tom Fletcher, who lived 3 blocks over, in a house that looked modest from the outside, but contained one of the most sophisticated home automation systems in the county. Tom had been an electrical engineer before retiring, and he'd spent the last 5 years turning his hobby of smart home technology into a consulting business that served clients throughout the region. Tom answered the door in work clothes, wiping his hands on a rag that smelled like solder and electronics. Arthur, good to see you. What brings you by? I need some advice about security systems, I said. The kind that can watch over a property when the owner isn't there. Tom's eyes lit up with the enthusiasm of a craftsman presented with an interesting challenge. What kind of property? Residential? Commercial? Both, potentially. The garage downtown and the lake house up north. I want to know if someone's there when they shouldn't be, and I want them to know they're being watched. Surveillance is easy these days. Cameras, motion sensors, remote monitoring. All of it can be controlled from your phone. But Arthur, what kind of trouble are you expecting? I considered how much to tell him. Tom was a good man, but he was also a gossip who couldn't keep a secret if his life depended on it. By next week, half the neighborhood would know Arthur Dalton was installing security systems on his properties. Perfect. Let's just say, I've got family members who think they know what's best for me, I said. I want to make sure they understand that my property is still my property until I decide otherwise. Tom nodded with the understanding of a man who'd dealt with his own adult children's well-meaning interference. I can set you up with a system that'll send alerts to your phone whenever someone approaches either location. High-definition cameras with night vision, two-way audio so you can talk to whoever's there, and automatic recording that gets stored in the cloud where nobody can tamper with it. How soon can you install it? I can have the lake house done by tomorrow afternoon, the garage by Monday morning. But, Arthur, this isn't going to be cheap. A professional-grade system for 2 locations is going to run you several $1,000s. Money well spent, I said. When can we start? That evening, I called my neighbor Mrs. Patterson, who'd lived 2 houses down for as long as I could remember. She was 73, sharp as a tack, and had appointed herself the unofficial neighborhood watch coordinator after a series of break-ins 5 years ago. "Arthur," she said when I explained what I needed, "of course I'll keep an eye on things. But should I be worried? Are you expecting trouble?" "Nothing dangerous," I assured her. "Just family complications. If you see anyone at my house when I'm not there, especially if they look like they're trying to get inside, I'd appreciate a phone call." "Family complications are the worst kind," she said, with the wisdom of someone who'd raised 4 children and survived to tell about it. "Don't you worry. I'll watch over things like a hawk." Saturday morning, I met Tom at the lake house. The drive north gave me time to think about what I was really doing: installing security systems, mobilizing neighbors, setting up legal barriers. All of it felt like preparing for war. But that's exactly what it was. David had fired the first shot at that restaurant dinner, and now I was building the defenses I should have constructed months ago. The lake house looked peaceful in the morning light, sunlight dancing on the water through gaps in the pine trees. Tom spent an hour walking the property, taking measurements and photos, planning camera angles and sensor placement. "This is a beautiful place," he said as we stood on the dock. "How long have you owned it?" 27 years. My wife and I bought it when David was in high school. We thought we'd retire here eventually, spend our golden years watching the seasons change over the water. You still could. Maybe, but first I need to make sure it stays mine to enjoy. Tom installed cameras at every possible approach to the house: the main driveway, the walking path from the lake, the back deck where we used to barbecue on summer evenings. Motion sensors went in the trees, invisible to casual observation, but sensitive enough to detect anyone moving within 50 yards of the building. The centerpiece was a sophisticated doorbell camera that could recognize faces and send alerts when familiar or unfamiliar people approached. Tom programmed it with photos from my phone: David, Sarah, Marcus, Jonathan, and several other members of their social circle whose faces I'd captured from social media. "Now," Tom explained as he showed me the smartphone app that controlled everything, "anytime someone approaches the house, you'll get an alert with a photo. If it's someone you don't want there, you can activate the two-way audio and let them know they're being recorded. Most people leave pretty quickly once they realize they're on camera. And if they don't leave, the system automatically starts recording and uploading to cloud storage. You'll have permanent documentation of whoever was there and what they did. Plus, I've set it up to send alerts to the local sheriff's department if the motion sensors detect anyone inside the house without the alarm being properly disarmed." By Sunday evening, both properties were fully secured. I spent an hour testing the systems, walking around the garage and lake house while watching myself on my phone screen from multiple angles. The cameras were virtually invisible unless you knew where to look, but their coverage was comprehensive. Monday morning brought the first test. I was sitting in my kitchen, reading the newspaper over coffee, when my phone chimed with an alert from the lake house system. The screen showed David's BMW pulling into the driveway. I watched as David got out of the car and walked toward the front door, key in hand. He looked confident, purposeful, like a man who owned the place he was entering. The facial recognition system immediately identified him and sent me a notification. "Known person detected, David Dalton." David inserted his key into the lock and turned it. Nothing happened. I'd had Harold arrange for the locks to be changed over the weekend, part of the security upgrade. David tried the key again, then stepped back with obvious confusion. That's when I activated the two-way audio. "Hello, David." He spun around, looking for the source of my voice. "Dad, where are you?" "I'm at home, but I can see you're trying to break into my house." "Break in? I have a key." "You had a key. I've made some security improvements. As you can see, they're working perfectly. David moved closer to the door, and I could see his face clearly on the high-definition camera. The confusion was giving way to anger. Dad, what the hell is going on? Why can't I get into the house? Because it's my house, not yours. I've decided that from now on, people need permission to enter my property. Permission? I'm your son. Yes, you are. And as my son, you should have called before driving up here uninvited. David stood in front of the door for another 5 minutes, trying his key several more times and growing visibly frustrated. Finally, he got back in his car and drove away. The cameras tracked his departure, and I saved the entire interaction to my files. The message was clear. The old man wasn't as helpless as everyone thought. That afternoon, my phone rang. David's number. Dad, we need to talk. Do we? Yes, we do. What you did today was unacceptable. I've been going to that house for 20 years. I have every right to... You have the rights I give you, I interrupted. Nothing more, nothing less. Dad, I'm trying to help you. We all are. But if you're going to be paranoid and hostile... David, I said calmly, I think you should be very careful about your next words, because everything you say might be recorded, and anything you threaten might be shared with people you wouldn't want to hear it. The silence that followed was long and loaded. When David finally spoke, his voice was different, cooler, more calculated. I think we should have a family meeting, tonight, just the three of us, you, me, and Sarah. Clear the air. I think that's an excellent idea, I said. My house, 7 o'clock, and David, come ready to listen instead of talk. You might learn something. After I hung up, I called Harold to give him an update on the day's events. The trap is set, I told him. Now we'll see if they're smart enough to avoid it. Arthur, be careful. Cornered animals can be unpredictable. So can old men who've been pushed too far. That evening, I sat in my living room and waited for my son and daughter-in-law to arrive for what might be the most important conversation of our relationship. The legal documents were secure, the properties were protected, and the boundaries were clearly established. Now came the hard part, making David understand that his father wasn't a problem to be solved, but a man to be respected. And if he couldn't learn that lesson the easy way, I was prepared to teach it to him the hard way. They arrived exactly at 7, David's BMW pulling into my driveway with the precision of a military operation. Through the front window, I watched them sit in the car for several minutes, having what looked like a final strategy session. Sarah gestured emphatically while David nodded, both of them staring at my house like generals studying a battlefield. I'd spent the afternoon preparing for this conversation in ways they couldn't imagine. The digital recorder sat in my shirt pocket, fully charged and ready. Harold's business card lay on the coffee table next to copies of the trust documents, positioned where they couldn't help but notice them. And most importantly, I'd called Mrs. Patterson and asked her to keep her living room lights on, a signal that friendly eyes were watching from next door. When they finally approached the door, I was ready. David, Sarah. I stepped back to let them enter, noting how they both glanced around the familiar space, as if seeing it through new eyes. Please, sit down. They chose the couch, sitting closer together than usual, a united front facing a common adversary. Sarah wore her armor of choice, a cream-colored blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her blonde hair pulled back in a style that said she was serious about business. David had opted for khakis and a polo shirt, the uniform of a man trying to appear casual while feeling anything but. Dad, David began, his voice carrying the forced patience of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation. We need to address what happened today at the lake house. You mean when you tried to enter my property without permission? I mean when you treated your own son like a criminal for visiting a house I've been going to since I was 16. I settled into my chair, the one that gave me a clear view of both their faces. David, when you were 16, you asked permission before taking the car. You called when you were going to be late. You understood that respect was a two-way street, even between family members. Sarah leaned forward, her expression carefully modulated to project concern rather than impatience. Arthur, we're worried about you. The security cameras, the changed locks, this sudden paranoia about family. It's not normal behavior. Paranoia, I repeated. Interesting choice of words. What exactly am I being paranoid about? About us trying to help you, David said. about the people who love you, wanting what's best for your future. I reached for the coffee table and picked up Harold's business card, turning it over in my fingers like a poker chip. Tell me something, David. That dinner last week, how long did you plan it? What do you mean? The restaurant, the guest list, the coordinated talking points about my assets and liquidity. How long did you and your friends spend preparing that presentation? David's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It wasn't a presentation. It was a conversation among people who care about you. People who care about me, I said slowly. Like Marcus, who's never spoken to me for more than 5 minutes before that night. Like Jonathan, who couldn't remember my name until you introduced us. Like Trevor, who spent the entire evening calculating the square footage of my properties with his eyes. Sarah shifted on the couch, her composure beginning to crack around the edges. Arthur, you're reading too much into social dynamics. Sometimes business people talk about business. It doesn't mean there's some conspiracy against you. You're right, I said. It's not a conspiracy. Conspiracies are secret. What you've been doing is right out in the open, at least for anyone paying attention. I stood and walked to the mantel, where Margaret's photo looked down on this strange family reunion. 2 months ago, you started asking about my retirement plans. Last month, you mentioned that the house was too big for one person. 3 weeks ago, you brought up assisted living communities. And last week, you staged a dinner where 4 successful businessmen spent 2 hours explaining to me why I should liquidate everything I've worked for. We're trying to help you plan for the future, David insisted. No, I said, turning back to face them. You're trying to plan my future for me. There's a difference. Sarah stood abruptly, her patience finally exhausted. Arthur, let's be honest here. You're 78 years old. 68. You're 68 years old, living alone in a house you can barely maintain, holding on to properties you don't use, refusing to acknowledge that you need help managing your affairs. That's not independence. That's denial. The room went very quiet. I could hear the tick of the mantel clock, the distant sound of Mrs. Patterson's television through the thin walls, the soft hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. David looked uncomfortable with his wife's directness, but he didn't contradict her. Sarah, I said finally, I appreciate your honesty. It's refreshing after weeks of carefully worded concern and strategic sympathy. So, let me return the favor. I walked back to the coffee table and picked up the manila folder I'd prepared for this moment. You want to talk about denial? Let's talk about your finances. David's face went pale. What? Your mortgage payments are 3 months behind. Your business loan is in default. And according to the credit reports I had Harold pull, perfectly legal for someone considering a family financial arrangement, you've been borrowing against your 401k to maintain the lifestyle you think you deserve. Sarah's mouth opened, then closed. David started to speak, then stopped. You see, I continued, when someone starts talking about my assets and my need for assisted living, I get curious about their motives. And what I discovered is that you don't want to help me. You need to help yourselves. I opened the folder and spread several documents across the coffee table. Bank statements, credit reports, loan documents, all the financial reality they'd been hiding behind their expensive clothes and confident speeches. The plan was simple, wasn't it? I said. Convince the old man he can't take care of himself. Get him into assisted living where his assets could be managed by family members who understand modern financial planning. Sell the properties, liquidate the investments, and solve your debt problems with my life's work. David found his voice. Dad, it's not like that. It's exactly like that. I picked up another document from the folder. This is a copy of your application for a home equity loan, denied last month because your debt-to-income ratio is too high. And this is a copy of the inquiry Sarah made to that assisted living community in Westchester. Not about availability, but about their policies regarding family financial management for residents. Sarah sank back onto the couch, her face flushed with anger or embarrassment, or both. You had us investigated, your own family? I had my financial situation evaluated by professionals, which is exactly what any rational person would do when family members start making unsolicited suggestions about asset management. The fact that the investigation revealed your desperation is just a bonus. David leaned forward, his hands clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. Okay, Yes, we have some financial pressures. Yes, we thought your situation might provide solutions that would benefit everyone involved. But Dad, that doesn't change the fact that you need help, that you're isolated and aging and making decisions that don't make rational sense. Like what decisions? Like spending thousands of dollars on security systems to keep your own family away from properties you barely use. Like changing locks and installing cameras instead of having honest conversations with people who love you. I walked back to my chair and sat down, feeling the familiar comfort of the cushions that had supported me through thousands of evenings with Margaret. David, do you know what your mother's greatest fear was during those last weeks in the hospital? The question caught him off guard. What? That you'd grow up to be the kind of man who mistakes taking for giving, who confuses need with love, who thinks that wanting something badly enough makes you entitled to it. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. Sarah stared at her hands, while David looked everywhere, except directly at me. She wrote you a letter, I continued. 3 years ago, lying in that hospital bed, knowing she was dying, she wrote you a letter about what kind of man she hoped you'd become. I've been waiting for the right time to give it to you. I pulled Margaret's letter from the folder and held it up so they could see her handwriting on the envelope. But sitting here tonight, listening to you explain why I should surrender my independence to solve your financial problems, I realized something. You're not ready for this letter. You may never be ready for it. David's voice was barely a whisper. Dad, please. The trust documents are signed, I said, cutting him off. The properties are protected. The security systems are installed. And most importantly, Harold Brennan has clear instructions about my wishes for the future. I stood again and walked to the front door, opening it wide. The October air was crisp with the promise of winter, and Mrs. Patterson's living room light glowed reassuringly in the darkness. I think this conversation is over. Sarah was the first to move, gathering her purse with sharp, angry movements. This is a mistake, Arthur. You're making enemies of the people who care about you most. No, I said. I'm making boundaries with the people who care about my assets most. David hesitated at the door, looking back at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Dad, what if you're wrong? What if we really were just trying to help? I thought about Margaret's letter, about the boy who used to help me in the garage, about the man who'd brought strangers to dinner to pressure his own father into surrender. Then you'll have to learn to help in ways that don't require me to disappear, I said. After they left, I closed the door and stood in the hallway for a long moment, listening to the familiar sounds of a house that was truly mine again. The clock ticked steadily, marking time that belonged to me. The refrigerator hummed its quiet song. Somewhere in the walls, the old wood settled inside the way it had for 40 years. I walked to the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water, then returned to the living room where the trust documents still lay scattered across the coffee table. Legal protections, financial barriers, technological surveillance, all the armor I'd built to defend against my own son. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like necessity. My phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Saw the lights were on late. Everything okay? Mrs. P. I smiled and typed back. Everything's fine. Thank you for watching over things. That's what neighbors are for. Sleep well. I gathered up the documents and returned them to their folder, then checked the locks and turned off the lights. Upstairs, Margaret's photo watched from her dresser as I prepared for bed, and I found myself talking to her the way I had every night since she died. I think I finally understood what you were trying to tell me, I said, about standing up for what matters, about not letting people make me smaller than I am. The house was quiet around me, but it felt different now. Not empty, but peaceful. Not lonely, but independent. I'd drawn the lines that needed to be drawn, set the boundaries that should have been set months ago. David would have to decide what kind of relationship he wanted with the father he had, rather than the compliant old man he'd been trying to create. And I would sleep soundly, knowing that tomorrow I'd wake up in my own house, surrounded by my own choices, accountable to no one but the woman whose memory had taught me that love without respect was just another form of control. The war wasn't over, but tonight at least, I'd won the battle that mattered most, the battle to remain myself. The call came at 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in November, 3 weeks after our confrontation. I was standing at the kitchen counter, waiting for the coffee to finish brewing when David's name appeared on my phone screen. The early hour told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a social call. Dad? His voice was tight, controlled in the way that meant he was barely holding back anger. We need to talk. Good morning to you too, David. Don't. Just don't. I could hear traffic in the background, the sound of his BMW's turn signal clicking steadily. I just got off the phone with Harold Brennan. He says you've made some changes to your will. I took my time pouring coffee into Margaret's favorite mug, the blue one with tiny flowers around the rim. Harold's a thorough attorney. I'm sure he explained everything clearly. He explained that you're giving away my inheritance to strangers. I'm giving away my property to organizations that will use it to help people. There's a difference. The turn signal stopped clicking. David had pulled over, probably unable to concentrate on driving, while his carefully constructed future crumbled in real time. Dad, you can't do this. That lake house? Mom loved that place. She wouldn't want it going to people she never met. Your mother loved that place because of what it represented. Family, peace, healing. The veterans who use it will understand those values better than someone who sees it as a real estate investment. And the garage? 40 years of your work, and you're just throwing it away? I walked to the window and looked out at the November morning, gray and crisp, with the kind of light that made everything look honest. I'm not throwing it away. I'm making sure it serves the same purpose it always has, teaching people to work with their hands, to build something meaningful, to take pride in honest labor, by giving it to strangers instead of your own son. David, I said quietly, you've made it very clear that you don't want the garage. You want the land it sits on. You don't want the business I built. You want the money you could make by tearing it down. The silence that followed was long enough for me to take 3 sips of coffee and watch a cardinal land on the bird feeder Margaret had hung outside the kitchen window. What about family legacy? David's voice was different now, smaller. What about keeping things in the family? Legacy isn't about keeping things, it's about keeping values. And the values I want to pass on, hard work, service to others, respect for what came before, those will live on through the people who benefit from these gifts. So that's it? You've just written me out of your life completely? I thought about Margaret's letter, still sitting in my desk drawer, waiting for the day when David might be ready to understand what his mother had tried to tell him. You'll inherit this house when I'm gone. It's modest, but it's paid for, and it's yours. Beyond that, I paused, choosing my words carefully. Beyond that depends on what kind of man you choose to be going forward. What's that supposed to mean? It means the door isn't locked, David, but you'll have to decide whether you want to walk through it as my son or as someone looking for assets to manage. He hung up without saying goodbye. I spent the rest of that morning at the lake house, driving the familiar route through countryside that had grown more beautiful as the leaves turned from green to gold to the bare honesty of approaching winter. Tom's security system tracked my arrival, sending an alert to my phone that made me smile. I was being notified of my own presence on my own property. The house felt different now that I knew its future was secure. Walking through rooms where Margaret and I had spent so many summers, I could imagine other families finding the same peace we'd discovered here. Veterans returning from deployments, carrying invisible wounds that only time and quiet could heal. Children who'd never seen a lake learning to fish from the same dock where I'd taught David 20 years ago. I spent the afternoon going through closets and drawers, sorting through possessions that had accumulated over decades of marriage. Margaret's summer clothes, books she'd read on rainy afternoons, the collection of smooth stones she'd gathered from the shoreline over the years. Each item held a memory, but I found I could touch them now, without the sharp pain that had kept me frozen for 3 years. Some things I boxed for donation. Others I set aside for the families who would stay here in the future. Practical items like extra blankets and kitchen utensils, but also small treasures like Margaret's collection of local hiking guides and her carefully annotated bird identification books. As the sun began to set, I walked down to the dock and sat in the same spot where Margaret and I had shared thousands of quiet evenings. The water was still, reflecting the sky like polished glass. A loon called from somewhere across the lake, its voice wild and haunting in the gathering dusk. My phone buzzed with a text message, not from David this time, but from Sarah. Arthur, I think we all said things we didn't mean. Can we start over? I stared at the message for a long moment before typing back. Some things once said can't be unsaid, but people can choose to act differently going forward. Her response came quickly. What would that look like? I thought about Margaret's letter, about the years of birthday calls that never came, about the grandchildren I'd never met because their parents thought I was too sad, too simple, too much of a reminder of their own mortality. It would look like respect, I typed, for who I am, not who you think I should become. The conversation ended there, but something had shifted. Not forgiveness, that would take time and actions, not words. But acknowledgement, perhaps. Recognition that the old man they had tried to manage wasn't going away quietly. 3 months passed. Winter settled over both properties with the kind of thoroughness that transforms familiar landscapes into something stark and beautiful. I developed new routines, mornings at the garage, where I'd begun teaching basic auto repair to a group of veterans Harold had connected me with. Afternoons at home, where I finally began going through Margaret's things with something approaching peace rather than pain. The security systems proved their worth several times. David made 2 more unauthorized visits to the lake house, both documented in high-definition video that showed him walking around the property with the frustrated energy of someone trying to solve a puzzle with missing pieces. I didn't confront him directly, but I made sure Harold had copies of the recordings. On a cold February morning, my neighbor Mrs. Patterson knocked on my door with a plate of cookies and news from the neighborhood gossip network. "Arthur," she said, settling into Margaret's chair with the comfortable authority of a woman who'd earned the right to speak her mind. "I heard David's been asking around about your mental state, talking to Dr. Morrison, to the pharmacist at Walgreens, to anyone who might have observations about your cognitive function." I set down my coffee cup carefully. "Is that so?" Seems he's building some kind of case. Harold Brennan might want to know about it." "I'm sure Harold already knows, but thank you for the warning." Mrs. Patterson studied my face with sharp eyes that had seen 8 decades of human behavior. "You're not surprised. A desperate man will try desperate measures. David's running out of options for getting what he thinks he deserves. And what are you going to do about it?" I thought about the question as I walked her to the door, watching her navigate the icy sidewalk with the careful steps of someone who'd learned that falling at our age carried consequences younger people didn't worry about. What was I going to do? The answer had been forming gradually over the months since that confrontation in my living room, crystallizing like ice on a windshield. I was going to live, not survive, not endure, not wait for time to solve problems that required action. I was going to live deliberately, purposefully, on my own terms, and according to my own values. That afternoon, I called the veterans organization that would inherit the lake house and arranged to meet with their director. Ellen Morrison was a former Army medic in her 50s, with calloused hands and the kind of direct gaze that came from seeing too much, but choosing hope anyway. "Mr. Dalton," she said as we walked through the empty house, "this place is going to change lives. We've got families who've been waiting 2 years for a retreat like this." "How soon can you start using it?" "Well, the legal transfer won't be complete until—" She hesitated. "I don't want to sound like I'm rushing anything. This is your home. It was my home. Now it's going to be theirs." I handed her a key, one of 3 I'd had made for the new locks. "Consider this an early gift. Start bringing families here now. Let them make memories while I'm still around to see it happen." The first family arrived 2 weeks later. Staff Sergeant Maria Santos, her husband Carlos, and their twin daughters, 8 years old and full of questions about everything from the loons on the lake to the height of the pine trees. I watched from my car as they unloaded suitcases and fishing gear, the girls running toward the water with the fearless enthusiasm of children who'd never met a lake they couldn't conquer. Maria had lost her left leg to an IED in Afghanistan. Carlos was learning to be married to someone whose nightmares woke them both at 3 a.m. The girls were learning that sometimes mommy needed to sit quietly for a while, that loud noises made her jump, that love looked different in a family touched by war. They spent 4 days at the lake house. I drove by each morning, not to check on them, but to see the lights in the windows, to watch smoke rise from the chimney, to know that the house was full of life again. On their last day, Maria knocked on my car window as I sat in the driveway taking photos for my own memories. "Mr. Dalton, I'm Maria Santos. Ellen told me you're the one making this possible." I rolled down the window and found myself looking into eyes that had seen too much, but somehow still sparkled with gratitude. "It's just a house," I said. "No, sir, it's not. It's hope. It's a place where my girls can see their mama smile again. It's a place where my husband and I remembered how to talk to each other without talking about the war." She reached through the window and squeezed my hand. "It's a place where healing happens." After they left, I sat on the dock one last time as the owner of the lake house. The March air was still cold, but there was something different in it, the promise of spring, of new growth, of seasons turning as they always had and always would. My phone rang. David's number. "Dad," he said, and something in his voice was different, quieter. "I heard about the veterans' family, about you letting them use the house early. Word travels fast in a small community. Sarah and I drove by yesterday, saw the little girls playing on the dock. They looked—" He paused. "They looked happy." I waited, letting the silence carry whatever weight it needed to carry. "Maybe I was wrong about some things," he said finally. "Maybe you know better than I thought about what matters." "Maybe," I agreed. "Dad, could we try again? Not about the properties or the money or any of that. Just, could we try to be family again?" I thought about Margaret's letter, still waiting in my desk drawer, about the boy who'd learned to fish from this dock, who'd helped me stack firewood on October afternoons, who'd fallen asleep in the back seat on the drive home from family vacations. "David," I said, "family isn't something you try to be. It's something you choose to do every day, in small ways that add up to love." "I know, I think I forgot that for a while. The door's always been open," I said, "but when you walk through it, you need to come as my son, not as someone with plans for my future." "I understand." "Do you? Because understanding means accepting that I'm going to live my life according to my values, not your financial projections. It means visits because you want to see me, not because you need something from me." "I understand," he said again, and this time I almost believed him. After we hung up, I sat on the dock until the sun set and the first stars appeared over the lake. Tomorrow, I would drive home to the house where Margaret and I had built our life together. Next week, I would start transferring ownership of the garage to the vocational training program. Next month, the lake house would officially belong to the Veterans Organization. But tonight, I was exactly where I belonged, surrounded by water that reflected starlight, breathing air that smelled like pine and possibility, wrapped in the quiet satisfaction of a man who'd protected what mattered most. Margaret's voice whispered in the evening breeze. "Well done, Arthur. Well done." I stood slowly, my joints protesting the cold, but my spirit lighter than it had been in years. The boy I'd raised was gone, replaced by a man I was still learning to know. But the father I'd always been, the one who loved fiercely and stood firmly and chose hope over fear, that man was still here, and he was finally free. If you find the story interesting, comment number 1. If you find it sad, comment number 2.